and thank you very much for coming along. I'm going to be reading from my paper. There is a PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is really, as I think PowerPoint should be, illustrative. It's not, you'll be pleased to know, telling you exactly what I'm going to be reading to you and sharing with you from the paper itself. And the paper is an adaptation of an essay that was originally a conference paper, and the conference paper came from a symposium that I organised almost 2 years ago to the week in 2014, the year of Leonard Cohen's 80th birthday. I decided, as a long-time fan of Leonard Cohen, an admirer of Leonard Cohen's work, and also I'd just been involved in a project of collected essays relating to Nick Cave, another one of my kind of contemporary musical heroes. And so I thought, well, you know, if it's possible to have a day event where we treat someone like Cohen and Cave as seriously as we would treat, I don't know, Shelley or Keats or whoever, then let's go ahead and do it. And I've got very, very happy memories of that day. I was able to secure Sylvie Simmons, who is Cohen's authorised biographer. We managed to fly her over from San Francisco, and that was great because in terms of anyone who's a follower of Leonard Cohen and an admirer of his music, I mean, her book is a sort of definitive biography. And we also had a concert in the evening, not, I'm afraid to say, with Leonard Cohen himself, although he did send an absolutely lovely and charming and ironic message to me on the day of the conference, which I read out to everyone that was there. But I was able to secure a very, very fine Irish singer-songwriter, jazz musician, jazz vocalist called Christine Tobin, who had just released an album of revisitings of some Cohen classics, and that had garnered some very, very, very fine reviews itself. So it was a great day. And on the 1st of January in 2017, just over 2 years on, the edited collection of those papers into essays is going to be published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing. So I'm really delighted and excited about that, and it means that the content of that day and the creative energy and the thinking and the performance and everything else is kind of kept and disseminated for others. Okay, I'm hoping at the very end that we can watch a very short clip of Leonard Cohen performing Suzanne, one of his iconic songs, from a recent performance. Hello, come in. So the focus of the conference, which we called Visions from the Tower of Song, and which has remained as a subtitle of the new book, was really on the themes of spirituality and desire across Leonard Cohen's, you know, impressive and extensive oeuvre as a singer and songwriter, and also, of course, before he ever achieved fame in that context, he had been a critically acclaimed novelist and poet in Canada, his land of birth. And my talk today, therefore, is going to focus on the image, what I've called the leitmotif of the wounded man, which I believe is a powerful presence across the songs and poetry of Leonard Cohen. You who must leave everything that you cannot control. It begins with your family, but soon it comes round to your soul. I've been where you're hanging. I think I can see where you're pinned. When you're not feeling holy, your loneliness tells you you've sinned. And in this second verse of Leonard Cohen's iconic early song, Sisters of Mercy, one finds oneself in territory familiar and constantly revisited in his work. And this is the topography of transgressive desire with its consequential suffering and subsequent existential isolation. In a short adapted poem, God is Alive, Magic is Afoot, originally appearing in Cohen's controversial, critically acclaimed novel Beautiful Losers from 1966, the narrator observes, "Many hurt men wondered, many struck men bled, magic never faltered, magic always led, many stones were rolled, but God would not lie down." And throughout his work, Cohen journeys and invites his listeners to travel with him through this darkly disorientating landscape. It is not without pathos. A sense of the tragic, especially in the battleground of intimate interpersonal relationships, is often its compass. And this geo-psychological domain evokes an unsettling cartographic fusion of Goya-esque images of war-ravaged, tortured bodies and the harrowing iconography of the crucified Christ. And such archetypal images encompass and evoke paintings in the genre of religious art, from Grunewald's nightmarish medieval depictions through to later 20th century post-Holocaust depictions of a Christ of Buchenwald rather than Bethlehem by artists such as Graham Sutherland and Francis Bacon. The term Holocaust has its etymological roots from the Greek holocaustos, holos, whole, and kaustos, burnt. 1/3 of the total worldwide Jewish population were killed during the Holocaust. The Eastern European Jewish population was particularly hard hit, being reduced by 90%. And while a disproportionate number of Jewish religious scholars would be killed, more than 80% of the world's total at that time, the perpetrators of the Holocaust did not merely target religious Jews. And there is therefore a central and crucial sense, I believe, in which all Jews and Jewish artists, such as Cohen himself, are not only indelibly marked by the historical facts of the Holocaust, but also spiritually and psychologically shadowed and scarred. The psycho-emotional individual, in a post-Freudian sense, and the ethnic, religious, communal collective coexist in this dialectical interplay of the wounded man. It is both deeply personal, deeply psychological, but it also has a very clear material historical frame. Envisaged and prophesied in early Judaic visionary writing, the profound poignancy and tragic pathos of this wounded man is evocatively expressed in the Old Testament writings of the prophet Isaiah, where this mythic figure is described as despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. And in her critically acclaimed biography of Cohen, I'm Your Man, The Life of Leonard Cohen, Sylvie Simmons cites Rabbi Mordecai Finley as remarking of Cohen, quote, "He's deeply well read, very committed to understanding Kabbalah, not so much as a theology, but as spiritual psychology and a way to mythically represent the divine. And if you understand that human consciousness is basically symbolic, then one has to find some kind of symbol system that most closely articulates one's understanding of all levels of reality." End of quote. The term Kabbalah, whilst complex and multifaceted in its historical and cultural development, has its origins in the Jewish mystical tradition. It is, in fact, a systemic and systematic encoding and formulation of esoteric spiritual knowledge. And of particular interest and relevance in exploring Cohen's creative Kabbalah-esque symbolic reality and its themes is the concept of the Sephiroth, which are the 10 manifestations of the characteristics and qualities of the divine. 2 poetic images are employed traditionally in the Kabbalah to describe this phenomena. One is the image of the trees of life and knowledge, which emphasizes the theological dimension of the Sephiroth. The other relates to the iconic archetype of Adam, we would normally pronounce that name, of course, Adam, which expresses the anthropological dimension of the divine in human form and culture. The last emerging of the 10 Shekinah is the feminine divine presence. And this Shekinah in particular has associations of the divine light that emanates from the ontologically invisible nature of the mystery of God. And central to this philosophical and spiritual system is the accompanying view that the male and female are in a state of continuous existential and psychosymbolic action. This process both challenges harmony through its often discordant nature and conflict, but also offers a means, amongst others, through which human and cosmic concord can be realigned, a kind of resurrected, transformed Eden. And it's this essay's contention that throughout Cohen's creative output, over a period of remarkable longevity, he has developed a symbolic system that most deeply articulates his own understanding of all levels of reality. It is a profoundly layered dialectic. And in this systematic, symbolic aesthetic, he explores constructs of the spiritual interfacing with the material, the microcosm of the personal with the macrocosm of history, the sacred and the profane. And simultaneously there exists in this iconographic, symbolically imagined universe of Cohen's desire in direct counterpoint with its Janus twin, judgment, and with that the inevitability of redemptive suffering. As Cohen sings with bittersweet irony in what had been up until this month his most recent studio album, Popular Problems, quote, "It's almost like the blues." Central, I believe, to this ontological narrative spine is the unifying iconic figure of the wounded man, torn, tortured and forsaken. Central to this essay, additionally, is the belief that this man of sorrows, this wounded man, is equally and simultaneously a paradigm of Cohen himself as a transgressive poet and lover. And in that sense, he is in some respects a metaphor of a first Adam. In this role, he inhabits an internal state of exile from a pre-fall paradise. In some later Christian mystical developments of aspects of the Kabbalah, redesignated as Kabbalah being spelt with C to distinguish it from the pre-existing Jewish system, the symbolic motif of the tree of life and knowledge is visualized as growing seamlessly out of the mythical resurrected body of Christ. And this longing for a return to a lost symbolic Eden is palpably expressed in dialectical counterpoint with Cohen's perceptive understanding of the transient clothing of not only desire, love and regret, but also of mortality itself. This is expressed in a song such as Going Home from 2012, quote, "Going home without my sorrow, going home sometime tomorrow, going home without the costume that I wore." The absence of costume carries with it an innate condition of nakedness and vulnerability, but this is more existential, I feel, than materialist. So he takes the materiality of the notion of the costume and uses and explores that as a construct of identity, and when that costume is withdrawn or disrupted in any way, we enter into a state of vulnerability. And this is a frequent phenomena across Cohen's songs and poems. It's expressed in exquisitely poignant Oedipal fashion when he sings of In the Night Comes On from 1984, I said, this is quotation from that song, I said, "Mother, I'm frightened, the thunder and lightning, I'll never come through this alone." But the narrator is gently and movingly reassured and encouraged by her, quote, "She said, I'll be with you, my shawl wrapped around you, my hand on your head when you go. I wanted the night to go on and on, but she said, go back to the world. Cohen is an inveterate expression and lover of sartorial style, unsurprising perhaps given his father's business. The trademark fedora and double-breasted suit of his post-2008 sellout tours has assumed the status of a stylish retro sensibility, located somewhere between 40s American film noir and the 20th century signifier of the tragic and illusory nature of the American dream, embodied in the iconic character of Arthur Miller's Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman, another Cain cursed to travel an unforgiving world. And this sense of the poet-singer performing, if not masquerading, multiple versions of himself, we're back to that notion of costume again, is self-critically, caustically, and uncompromisingly enforced in Going Home, once again when Cohen sings, quote, I love to be with Leonard. He's a sportsman and a shepherd. He's a lazy bastard living in a suit. Like some ventriloquist dummy from the Grand Guignol of Freud's concept of the uncanny, this manipulated, malleable Leonard, quote, does do what I tell him, even though he doesn't want to. He just doesn't have the freedom to refuse. Given the demeaning and dispiriting sense of existential and creative impotence evoked in Going Home, one remembers how Cohen had also memorably sang earlier in his career with characteristic self-demeaning, darkly comic irony, quote, I'm your man. In this song, Leonard Cohen, or one of his costumed alter egos, intones a litany or catechism of prescribed roles which might, just might, afford him some provisional quasi-intimacy with one of his many unnamed objects of desire. And out of this cast list of outworn disguises and fading variety hall or burlesque outfits, there features one get-up in particular which promises that, quote, if you want another kind of love, I'll wear a mask for you. In a similar vein of mordantly witty self-assassination, in the recorded DVD of his 2014 Live in Dublin concert, Cohen edits this lyric in his 80th year to, quote, I'll wear an old man's mask for you. The mask in its original usage, with its liminal associations perhaps of a sadomasochistic sexual role play, is, I believe, a cryptically redolent version of the treacherous straits of Cohen's many sexual adventures and encounters. In the song 1,000 Kisses Deep from 2001, Cohen assumes this time the mask and costume of a doomed sojourner lover contemplating the shipwreck of yet another intimate relationship. Quote, confined to sex, we pressed against the limits of the sea. I saw there were no oceans left for scavengers like me. I made it to the forward deck. I blessed our remnant fleet and then consented to be wrecked 1,000 kisses deep. One might observe that another leitmotif is that of the drowning man, which is also another predominant seraphim of the metamask of the wounded man as it features and expresses itself across Cohen's work. Cohen's narrator alter ego in 1,000 Kisses Deep lives, quote, his life as if it's real, end of quote, a powerful and potent postmodern metaphor of performed identity. Expressing as he did in Suzanne, that early classic, of his symbolic, metaphorical Christ, that, quote, only drowning men can see him, Cohen himself consents to be wrecked as a profound metaphor of desire as loss, as death, a death that might liberate. As the following quote from Cohen clearly conveys, such disguises and changes of costume is not a perversely chosen self-dramatizing persona, but more so a mask that fate and history, personal and political, has trapped him in. This is undeniably reiterated in Cohen's response to a question, "What do you consider to be your darkest hour?" asked by Gian Gomeshi in an edited transcript of an interview conducted originally for the Canadian broadcaster CBC and subsequently published in The Guardian. Cohen said, "Even to talk about oneself in a time like this is a kind of unwholesome luxury. I don't think I've had a darkest hour compared to the dark hours that so many people are involved in right now." This is pre-Trump. Large numbers of people are dodging bombs, having their nails pulled out in dungeons, facing starvation, disease. I mean large numbers of people. So I think that we've really got to be circumspect about how seriously we take our own anxieties today. In the 2 decades earlier February 1988 interview with Matt Snow, also published in The Guardian, Cohen had expressed corresponding sentiments after the relative failure of his album Various Positions, which he'd hoped might resurrect what had been a downward spiral in his personal and professional life at that time, characterised by drug addiction, certainly a form of alcoholism, and bankruptcy. Cohen said he had left behind him a shipwreck of 10 or 15 years of broken families and hotel rooms for some kind of shining idea that my voice was important, that I had a meaning in the cosmos. Well, after enough lonely nights in empty hotels, you don't care if you have a meaning in the cosmos or not. And this is typical of Cohen's exorciating self-honesty and unflinching sense of self-indicting moral perspective, and in sharp contrast to the endemic banality of voyeuristic confessional television within Western mass popular culture. And from the same interview, he reflected on his own vocation as a poet, singer, songwriter. Quote, "The work that was in front of me was just to cultivate this tiny corner of a field that I thought I knew something about, which was something to do with self-investigation without self-indulgence. Just pure confession I never felt was really interesting. But confession filtered through a tradition of skill and hard work is interesting to me. I'm entirely disinterested, therefore, in any self-dramatising or self-pitying expression of suffering, whether it be ethical or artistic." Nevertheless, as Finlay further observed in recognising Cohen's almost unique capacity for empathy and insight, interrogated with rigour, quote, and this is from Simmons again, "Modern students of Kabbalah," says Finlay, "are very interested in Leonard's work because they see him not as a theologian, but someone who really understands Kabbalah from within. He gets the inner ethos of brokenness and healing and the tragedy of the human condition." In Here It Is, from his album 10 New Songs, 2001, Cohen expresses this fractured human condition with scalpel-sharp sensibility, informed by an undertow of non-sentimental compassion. Quote, "Here is your cross, your nails and your hill, and here is the love that lists where it will." This construct, of course, of the wounded man is, however, neither narrowly religious nor exclusively individualised and secular. Cohen wrote of his work on writing Suzanne and talked about it in an interview in 1986, cited in Harvey Kubernik's Leonard Cohen Everybody Knows. Quote, "The writing of Suzanne, like all my songs, took a long time. I wrote most of it in Montreal, all of it in Montreal, over the space of perhaps 4 or 5 months. Sometimes the song would go off on a tangent and you'd have perfectly respectable verses, but that have led you away from the original feel of the song. So it's a matter of coming back. It's a very painful process because you have to throw away a lot of good stuff. Abiding, if not trapped within a complex metaphor of the cross, which was a form of public execution reserved exclusively for political opponents and activists against the Roman Empire during its occupation of first century Palestine, our scarred nomadic sojourner is existentially isolated and spiritually and emotionally crucified. This is not by nails and wood, however, but rather by the consequences of transgressive desire and longing, condemning him like the song's symbolic Jesus, quote, to a lonely wooden watchtower. I want to quote from Suzanne again. He creates an imagined site in which the rigidity and the detachment of the watchtower exists in uneasy and troubled tension with a metaphorical sea of unfathomed depths and currents, desires and longings. Quote, and Jesus was a sailor when he walked upon the water, and he spent a long time watching from his lonely wooden tower. And when he knew for certain only drowning men could see him, he said, all men will be sailors then, until the sea shall free them. And from a Marxist, culturally, theoretically informed, decentered reading of this figure, this man, imprisoned within his lonely wooden tower in Suzanne, the Jesus that Cohen invokes, I want to stress again, is not a sentimentalized or even necessarily Christian concept, but rather an elusive and potently incomplete, iconic construct. As Terry Eagleson states in relation to the theoretical writings of Pierre Macherey, quote, a work of art is tied to ideology not so much by what it says as by what it does not say. It is the significant silences of a text, in its gaps and absences, that the presence of an ideology can be most positively felt. The work, for Macherey, is always decentered. There is no central essence to it, just a continuous conflict and disparity of meanings. And the fundamental and crucial disparity between the individualized lovers of Cohen's songs and 6 million genocidal victims of mass industrialized annihilation signifies a silence of the historical and ideological connotations of Auschwitz, Belsen, and other locations of oppressive imprisonment and ultimately mass murder. These sites of devastating cruelty and inhumanity are subliminally present within the context of their absence. And this, I believe, creates what I would call a shifting space at the dialectical juncture between the thesis of the personal and the antithesis of the political, which is profound and yet ideologically and ethically problematic. It embodies a specific and also wider endemic paradox in the creative conception and cultural production of other of Cohen's songs. Against the, quote, invisible backdrop of the death camps, signalled by their perimeter fences and watchtowers, the visible presence of Cohen's male lover seeks redemptive liberation through the consummation of the sexual act and tryst with his female object of desire. And she exudes the elusive, decentered potency of the exotic, quote, tea and oranges that come all the way from China, along with a disruptively unstable, quote, you know that she's half crazy. And this particular, and in a sense original and defining invocation of the wounded man is likened to an alienated revolutionary prophet who, quote, himself was broken long before the sky would open. Forsaken, almost human, he sank beneath your wisdom like a stone. And the image on the right there, just to digress to the PowerPoint very, very briefly, are the railway tracks heading into Auschwitz. It could be any industrial goods yard, but indeed it's a place of mass industrialized slaughter. And it is in the ontological abandonment and forsakenness conveyed by Cohen's decentered Jesus that signifies a tragic conjunction, solidarity and shared fate with those destroyed in the absent presence of European history's virulent anti-Semitism, culminating in the mass murder exemplified in the living nightmare of the Shoah. The, quote, sinking of the individualized, tragic, iconic embodiment of his people evokes a mass disappearance of those lives, reawakened only in perpetual memory, grief and loss. And such a complex, potentially controversial and challenging interweaving of individualized and collective suffering and loss appears to implicitly and indirectly confront Adorno's often quoted injunction that, quote, the critique of culture is confronted with the last stage in the dialectic of culture and barbarism. To write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric, and that corrodes also the knowledge which expresses why it has become impossible to write poetry today. On the track A Street, co-written with his former partner and lover, Anjani Thomas, and featuring on, again, the 2014 album Popular Problems, Cohen employs the image of, quote, I see the ghost of culture with numbers on his wrist. Salute some new conclusion which all of us have missed. And this is an explicit reference to and signifier of the dehumanizing institutionalized coding by the Nazis of concentration camps inmates with a number tattooed on their wrists. It also exemplifies another example of a song in which tragic motifs from wider and vaster human suffering hover like a bird on the wire above the landscape of Cohen's creative domain. In this important and crucial sense, this bleak encoding epitomizing the dialectic of culture and barbarism, to quote Adorno, within a song which significantly interweaves desire as a contested site of suffering and conflict. It arguably therefore enters into a very problematic, if not controversial, in a controversial way, the hallowed collective memory territory of the Holocaust and its annihilation of identity by a Nazi regime rationalized by a German high culture of music, Beethoven, Mozart, Wagner and Strauss, philosophy, Leibniz and Kant, and literature, Goethe and Schiller. And furthermore, this unimaginable collision, if not collusion, of German high culture with the mass slaughter of 6 million Jews was also embodied in the Nazis' selection of concentration camp inmates who had been professional musicians prior to the war to form an orchestra who would perform Mozart, Beethoven, etc. at the entrance to Belsen. A classical Marxist reading of the ideological relationship between economic base interacting with culture as superstructure, the dialectic between the nature and function of dominant high cultural forms within the German tradition as a rationale against the economic imperative of Nazism as an ideological symptom of early mid-20th century capitalism in crisis. I want to go now to, again, probably one of the most well-known songs by Cohen, although ironically, when it was first broadcast, released on a 1980s album, Various Positions, it, like the album, rather sank without trace. But I think we have Jeff Buckley, the late Jeff Buckley, and lamented Jeff Buckley to thank, hallelujah, and also, of course, Rufus Wainwright. And Cohen confronts his critics, both religious, Jewish and secular, who had condemned him for writing a song in which the sacred name of God had allegedly been blasphemed through the transgression of its utterance. You say I took the name in vain, a direct quote from Hallelujah. I don't even know the name, but if I did, well, really, what's that to you? There's a blaze of light in every word. It doesn't matter which you heard. And Cohen said in an interview in 1985, cited in Kubernik, following soon on this original release of the song and the substantial criticism he received from different quarters, he said, "Hallelujah is a Hebrew word which means glory to the Lord. The song explains the many kinds of hallelujah do exist. I say, all the perfect and broken hallelujahs have an equal value. It's, as I say, a desire to affirm my faith in life, not in some formal religious way, but with enthusiasm, with emotion. And the holy subsequently navigates a binary dialectic of itself through the transgressive conflation of Cohen himself as poet-lover in dialectical correspondence with Jesus, or Yeshua in original Hebrew, who in Cohen's song, Suzanne, is almost human, almost human." Walter Benjamin wrote in his iconic and landmark essay, Theses on the Philosophy of History, "The soothsayers did not experience time as either homogeneous or empty." And I believe in a sense that there is a kind of prophetic soothsaying function within Cohen. I want to stress, not in a conventional sense and not trapped within any conventional boundaries of philosophical or psychological or religious thought. But Benjamin goes on to say, "We know that the Jews were prohibited from investigating the future. The Torah and the prayers instruct them in remembrance, however. This stripped the future of its magic, to which all those who succumb turn to the soothsayers for enlightenment. This does not imply, however, that for the Jews the future turned into a homogeneous, empty time, for every second of time was the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter." Now, I think, Walter Benjamin, as a secular Jew, was clearly not talking about or referring to the notion of the Messiah in a conventional religious sense, either Judaic or Christian. And I'm certainly not suggesting that Leonard Cohen is any kind of Messiah, and I'm sure the very thought or suggestion of it would not go down well with him. But violently marginalised and diminished and institutionally victimised through the cultural lexicon and ideological apparatus of Christianity's implicit schizophrenic anti-Semitism, through the economic machinery of capitalism, the history of a wounded people, and that relationship of the wounded people to the wounded man as a leitmotif, are thus both collectively present and identified, I would argue, by their absence. And through the complex construction within this dialectic, its visible lyric narrative in counterpoint with its subtextual other narrative of a fractured history of oppression and suffering helps, I believe, and contributes to defining and explaining the enduring immediacy and potency of a song, which goes beyond that of what would have been, frankly, many other similar kinds of folk songs of that period. We're talking about the mid-late 1960s. It's so much more than a love song. Nothing wrong with love songs, but I think that Suzanne, as in all of Cohen's work actually, will take from certain genre or subgenre, but that then he magics, he creates something which both challenges and transcends any kinds of easy boundaries. Cohen said in 1975, referring to his Jewish origins, his upbringing, and in a sense his, with a small p, broadly political perspective at that time. He had gone and entertained Israeli troops in the First War of the 1960s. He says, if you happen to be born Jewish and have been formed by Jewish sensibilities, then it's wholly appropriate that you look to the past through your own tradition. So in that sense, I could describe myself as a traditionalist. And in an interview with William Cloman in 1968, Cohen said, "The crucifixion will again be understood as a universal symbol, not just an experiment in sadism or masochism or arrogance." Equally and provocatively, the Tower may also, of course, be viewed as a site of isolated, sexualized masculinity. It's readable, I think, as a potent mix from a Freudian reading of Suzanne as a central disabling dialectic between the desired phallic intervention constrained by a deep detachment, itself the consequence, I believe, of Cohen's alienated sense of self, of which he has both written and talked about often. This is arguably a site, therefore, delineated by isolation, yet seeking communion through consummation and embrace of feminized waters. Suzanne, after all, leads you to the river, which is to the male gaze paradoxically alluring, yet simultaneously fathomless, shifting, and without boundaries. And given crucially that it is only drowning men who could see him, consummation as liberation can only be achieved in these terms by an act of self-abnegating abandonment. All men will be sailors then, until the sea shall free them. A seminal and transformative transition is therefore necessitated, yet resisted, of an ontological, existential, and psychological descent from the privileged yet isolating gaze and gendered site of the Tower. The descent from the Tower is expressed through the paradigm of the descent from the cross within Western European art, particularly in the Renaissance, an act of translucent tragedy, pathos and grief. Significantly, in terms of any Freudian or indeed post-structural reading of the term, used as a euphemism for the experience of sexual orgasm, la petite mort hovers within and through Cohen's song. And equally interestingly, Roland Barthes viewed the supreme and highest aspiration and function of the production and reception of literature as a metaphorical equivalent of sexual orgasm, an evocative parasignifier of Schopenhauer's notion of the sublime. So, if Roland could only have met Leonard or Leonard Roland, what a conversation that would have been. In conclusion, it's clear that a prevailing sense of anxiety, anguish and distress, to use Cohen's own words, has in one continuing and crucial sense abided in and throughout Cohen's career as a novelist, poet and songwriter over the 6 decades. It's a remarkable achievement, not just in terms of longevity, but also in terms of the depth, quality and unique nature of his creative vision. The conjunction of one of the most appalling periods in human history in the Holocaust, with themes and preoccupations of ethnicity, faith, spirituality and desire, intrinsically helps to define the special impact, relevance and appeal, I believe, of Cohen's songs to so many. They're deeply personal, cultural, psychological, and again, terms like spiritual are not really easy or helpful perhaps, but bear with me if we can use that term in its most elastic sense, metaphorical sense, profoundly spiritual concerns about human existence and our capacity to capture, however fleetingly, the sublime perception and experience of desire and sexual fulfillment. And in so many of Cohen's actual and many relationships, and indeed in the many songs and poems, too frequently their subsequent tragic failure and disappointment. All of this rings continuously true across his songs. And these songs speak to both a contemporary postmodern sensibility, but also archetypal myths and symbolic cadences in our earliest pre-classical oceans of consciousness. Furthermore, Cohen's capacity and unflinching and deeply wounded sense of our nightmarish scenarios of evil and humanity, bringing hell up from its origins below to make its infernal home on earth, is unforgettable and courageous. The wounded man as a leitmotif is therefore both profoundly personal and spiritual in function and perspective, yet also resonant of a history of a people and their trials, tribulations, longings and hopes. In their story is encapsulated the wider and deeper story of humankind, you and I. And despite so often at times in our contemporary postmodern world, a foreboding of overwhelming disaster, both human and ecological, and with the mass migration of the homeless and pitiable refugees across dangerous oceans and lands, Cohen nevertheless asserts, quote, "Ring the bell that still can ring," in his powerful call to ethical and political action in the song Anthem. And in the same song, he utilises the image and metaphor of the fissure or crack in everything, as he calls it, as simultaneously the ancient wound that disfigures us as human beings and disfigures even our best and most courageous aspirations, but crucially, a crack or fissure through which, quote, the light gets in. And it is the light, that symbolic light, that metaphorical light, that in the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition is the light of transformative feminine energy. And in the poetic mysticism of St. John, in the opening of the Gospel attributed to him, the light which the darkness can neither comprehend or overcome. And there is something of the fissure and the light, the wound and the healing in the songs of Leonard Cohen. And indeed, in and through Cohen as that most problematic and provocative signifier of the sacred and profane. As he says in his song, "You know who I am. You know who I am. You've stared at the sun. Well, I am the one who likes changing from nothing to one." Thanks very much.